So the session now is on engaging and incentivizing suppliers on climate, on other environmental issues, and on social goals. We have about an hour and 10, hour and 15 minutes. The way this is going to work, we'll have a conversation among the panelists for probably 30 to 40 minutes of our time, and then we'll go to Slido again for a discussion with you all from the floor. Just by way of introduction, we've got four great speakers from a diverse set of organizations. Michael Alexander, who is the Global Head of Water, Environment and Ag Sustainability at Diageo. We've Frederic Daniel, who's the Chief Technology Officer from Transparency One. We have Pierrick Barrault, who is Client Network Director at HSBC. And Alex Gershenson, who is the CEO and co-founder of SupplyShift. So we'll hear from each of those through our time today. I wanted to just sort of set the scene with a little story. So in the 1950s in the US, there was a very famous gangster called Willie Sutton, and he was at large for a number of years and wreaked havoc across the country. And he was eventually caught by the authorities. And as they were interviewing him, the police said, "Willie, why do you rob banks?" And he sort of looked round at them like they were crazy. And they said, "Well, I rob banks because that's where the money is." And I think when it comes to supply chain, absolutely the same logic applies. In the wider food and consumer goods supply chain, that's where 60% of global greenhouse gases are to be found. 3/4 of forced labor around the world is in the food and consumer goods supply chain. 2/3 of tropical deforestation. So the rationale for looking to suppliers, their suppliers, and so on really seems clear to me. But I wanted to start out by asking our panelists, what's their take on this? Why is engaging suppliers, why are supply chain issues important? Pierre, maybe we could start with you on that.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everybody. So one of the key elements for us when it comes to engaging suppliers, or when we work with large organizations, but not only. So at HSBC, my role in the client network team is to work with our large organization, the large customers, and work with their network to add value to their network. And quite often it comes to the sustainability in the supply chain. And why is it absolutely critical to work with suppliers? Because as you just said, Ewan, a lot of our companies says that up to 80% of their footprint is in the supply chain. So they can't resolve that. They can be as good as they want themselves. They can have solar panels. They can stop using fossil energy. They can be as good as they can in their own footprint and facilities, but there is a moment where you need to go beyond that. And there are investors, pressures, customers, and consumers who are expecting from not only the large organization, but also from their suppliers to actually participate and contribute to the sustainability of the ecosystem and the final product that they use. So this is why it becomes so important today for large organizations and down their supply chain, because you work with your tier 1 suppliers who themselves work with tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. And it's very important that it trickles down all the way through.
Great, thank you. Michael, I'll maybe ask you to give a company-specific take on that question.
Yeah, I think your analogy about the bank states it, doesn't it, really? It's absolutely critical, the supply chain, to any business, particularly consumer goods business, and such as Diageo. And I think where there's probably a misunderstanding, perhaps, is that this is a new thing. It's not new. I think Paul said earlier, he's been working with some of his suppliers for 5, 10, 20, 30 years, and the same would apply for a lot of consumer good companies. So we've always had and always want good relationships with our suppliers, and we've always wanted to try to influence that supply chain. Sometimes it's commercial, sometimes it's about risk assessment, a lot of it's about business continuity, and more recently, in the last 5 to 10 years, for us, it's been about sustainability and our sustainability risks. So I think it's absolutely fundamental that we do. You said it yourself that a large portion of our risk around environment and social and other risks is in our supply chain. We're being held more and more accountable for that, not just tier 1, but tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. Where does it stop? It's tricky because it's easy to have relationships with tier 1 suppliers because that's where you have a contractual arrangement with and where you have the relationship with. But when you get further down the supply chain, it becomes much more difficult. But that doesn't mean we don't have to do it. And that's where I think certainly from a Diageo perspective and a consumer goods company, I think some of the big challenges are those second and third and fourth tier often get smaller and smaller and smaller with less and less resources, probably less and less margins because they are third, fourth, fifth tier, and therefore how do we work with them through our principal contacts and the tier one suppliers to accelerate the change that we all know is needed. Great, thank you.
That's teed up nicely for the perspectives from the two companies that would help enable that conversation to happen. I'll maybe come to Alex first and then Frederick, but at the risk of asking you to give your sales pitch, what's your take on this? How does that work?
I'm not going to give my sales pitch. So I'm sure that most people here are aware of the Deloitte Chief Procurement Officer surveys that have been going on for probably about a decade now. And I don't know if you saw the 2018 one that just came out probably about 2 months ago. They finally started asking the questions that we are here to discuss, which is, does social responsibility matter, and how much do you know about your supply chain? And 6% of chief procurement officers of large corporations around the world said that they know who is in their supply chain. Not what they're doing yet, just who is in there. To your point of figuring out first, second, third, et cetera, to the source. You know, my customers, there are lots of different reasons why they are engaging with the who is in your supply chain and what they're doing. Some of it is regulatory for timber imports. Some of it is, very much voluntary. Some of it is tier one only, code of conduct. There are lots of different reasons why they're engaging with their suppliers. But the key thing, people in this room are at the forefront of this. But the vast majority of companies don't have simple visibility into their supply chains, let alone engaging with supplier, engaging and collaborating and moving the entire thing forward. So that to me is a major, major problem that is luckily being recognized because 34% of those same procurement officers said that this is their top priority, is to figure out social and environmental compliance in their supply chain. So there's a big gap, but this is the first time that Deloitte actually asked about anything but spend in their chief procurement officer survey. So that is how I come at this.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Frederick.
Yeah, thank you. If I may add to that, I think there is one angle that has not been really touched yet, is all of us. Before we are in business, we are all consumers, and our businesses are making money because we've got customers, and for CPG, this is about the consumers. And I think this is really a critical angle, discovering the supply chain, understanding what is happening, whether we're talking about social, whether we're talking about sustainability, whether we're talking about any other aspects, is critical because we need to align ourselves with the values of the consumers. And I think it is really becoming critical because I think there is a kind of departure from the big corporation to align themselves with the value of their consumers. And the only way to redo that, to rebuild that, is actually to really go deep within the supply chain, because the relationship have been existing for a very significant time with the tier one, but they are non-existent with the tier two, with the tier three, with the tier four. And the only way to prove to the consumers that brands and retailers know what they're talking about is they need to go and ask within the supply chain what is happening. So I think this is a critical element.
Great, great, thank you. I might come to Michael to lead us off on our next question. So now we know we need to do it. What do you actually do? How do you go about it? What techniques do you use? Who in supplier organizations do you go to make something happen?
Well, I think principally it's about procurement. We start off in our organisation with procurement and how we embed it in current systems and processes within our procurement part of the business. Because if we do it from a sustainability perspective, or we do it from a corporate relations or a public affairs perspective, that's never going to embed it in the business. It's going to be seeing these guys annoying us from the side that are trying to interfere with us making a better deal. If we can get it into the procurement function, then that is absolutely critical. And that's what we've tried to do. And it doesn't happen overnight for the very reasons that you've just mentioned. It doesn't happen overnight. And we're a big global organization with teams of procurement both centrally and also in market. So it does vary. But what we start off with is the leadership. So the top to top. Every tier one supplier, CEO will meet the CEO or the chief procurement officer regularly to look at relationship management and look at the commercials as well. So we make sure that that's in that conversation. But more importantly, I think, is in our category managers. So each organization in consumer goods will have a category manager. For us, it's for glass, or it's for closures, or it's for labels, or whatever it might be. Each has a category manager, and each of them has a relationship with that tier one supplier, tier one. And within those conversations, there needs to be not just conversations, but in contracts, there needs to be recognition that our policies and our ambitions around sustainability, whether it's social or whether it's environmental, need to be adhered to. So and that's about 80% of our tier one suppliers by category and by value. And I think that's where we start. It needs to be embedded in that. But we're very aware of the risk around tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers, as it were, and that's where we would turn to other programs, systemic programs across, for example, SEDEX. We're also members of CDP supply chain program, which is very recognizing the audit fatigue that companies get, getting multiple requests from different people. Then what we want to do is be part of the system rather than create our own system. We're actually quite a small company globally relative to many others. So why can't we embed ourselves within other systems and platforms? So that's the external bit. But that external bit will only work if we've got that internal process built in through our procurement, with support from the sustainability teams and others, identifying the issues and making sure the policies and the ambitions are fit for purpose. But if we don't get it in that bit, then the second bit won't work. And that makes a combination of the leadership, mentioning it in those top-to-top conversations, but also absolutely embedding it. So when we issue RFPs to suppliers, it's in there. This has to be done. So you have to report to CDP, supply chain program. You have to be part of this program. You have to meet our requests to disclose to SEDEX or whatever it might be. That's part of the contract, not a kind of wishful list coming from the sustainability team. It has to be part of the contract. And we're just, we're not by any means the best at it, and we're working our way through it because there's a lot of other priorities procurement have. But we need to get it into that system, into the normal day-to-day business processes. Otherwise, it won't last and it won't scale up.
Great, thank you, thank you. So technology is clearly an enabler of that in bringing people together, organizations together, pooling data, manipulating data. Frederick, do you want to say a little bit more about that, how it's an enabling function?
Yeah, so Transparency One is a technology platform, which is why I'm asking the question. but before talking about that, I think I would like to enlarge what you were saying, Michael, which is that, yes, it is about the leadership, but it's also and it is also about the overall company alignment. I think it is about procurement, it is about marketing, it is about HR, it is about finance, it is about quality, sustainability. I think this is really critical that within any company, the program is actually a strategic element, that it is completely aligned with the mission of the company, and that everybody, all of the different functions are behind it. Because the procurement is going to talk to the suppliers. They're very much going to talk about what they're going to supply and what is going to be the price. But they're going to be all the connections to the companies. And I think what is important is actually to create a kind of extended network. It is not only the company anymore, it is the extended company with all of those tier one suppliers that are kind of becoming part of this extended company. Because if you want to be able to touch efficiently tier 2, tier 3, they're far away from you. They don't have any business relationship with you. The only way to make that happen is that you don't consider your company as only what it is. You have a complete alignment within your company, and then you have a complete alignment within the extended company with all of your tier one suppliers, so that then you can really push that agenda. now talking about technology. In order to be able to make that happen in an efficient way, it is much easier to do that with a digital platform, which is kind of a social network that touch all of the different points within the supply chain, that if you want to do that with email, Words, Excel, which is kind of what we've seen when we approach new customers. This is very much what we see, that they start by doing that with the actual best technology for financial people, which is Excel, but which is not the best way to touch an entire network.
Great, thanks. Alex, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, we're aligned in a lot of ways. There's one piece that I want to add to that, which is the kind of pre-technology mode is data request, data return. And so the suppliers, they get the requests. They spend massive amounts of time filling out those requests, and then they hear nothing. In most cases, there might be feedback a year later at the annual, might be one paragraph at the, category buyer meeting to the wrong person at the wrong time, right? So there's very little immediate incentive for the suppliers to actually engage with this process, because there isn't a benefit, there isn't a perceived cost, there is no feedback. And so the way we look at it is it has to be, to the point of the session, there has to be a collaborative aspect. And so the suppliers must get business value out of this process at the time that they are engaging with the process, and with the right person, with the same person that is engaging with the process, because frequently the person that's meeting with the category buyer is a very different person than the person that is responding to the requests, right? None of this is new. And if that supplier, if that respondent is getting business value out of the process instantly, then it encourages response, because if they know they can get business value, they're more likely to engage with the process and not delay. And B, this becomes a truly automatically collaborative process. And then everybody learns and everybody benefits. And that's kind of our approach to the collaboration, is make it automatic, use the tools that we are using for data collection, also for supplier collaboration and learning.
Great, thank you. I guess we also know money makes the world go round, and so HSBC has and the financial community at large has an opportunity to help unlock a lot of this. Pierrick, would you like to say something about HSBC and where the wider industry is going?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to do the sales pitch either. One of the key elements I think that people are missing sometimes is that sustainability is also good for business. And what I mean when I say, and I want to resonate or rebound on what you both said, because I think it's quite important, it's not just about saving the planet or good for the planet, but it's really good for business. And what we mean by that, there is a virtuous circle that us bankers, you know how risk averse we are. So when we look at risk and the risk profile of some of these suppliers, we need to take into consideration the way technology makes them better, and the same as the way sustainability makes them better. And quite often we see that a more sustainable business is more efficient in the way they operate. And when they're more efficient in the way they operate, they become more agile and more adaptable to market shifts. And they also, quite often, the return on investment when you do a solid investment in capital expenditure like solar panels, water treatment units, waste recycling units, heat exchangers, when you do a significant investment, there is a return on investment that can be 3, 4, 5 years. Sometimes it's less than this, sometimes it's more than this. But ultimately, you're going to save costs. And we see that the businesses who have taken the wind of change are actually saving costs. And when they save costs, they become more profitable. And when they are more profitable, suddenly they have two characteristics. The first one is they can invest in innovation, and they can invest in social risks mitigants to make them more attractive for people. And that's why it's not, you were talking about HR, Frederick, and I think it's critical. There is an element of attracting talents. And the more sustainable you are as a business, the more you attract talents. The more profitable you are, the more you attract banks and investors. And we do a survey every year called HSBC Navigator, and I'm not going to bore you with stats, even if I'm the banker in the room. But basically, we do an analysis of 8,500 businesses across 34 markets. And we ask them three things. We ask them about how is sustainability, is your supply chain a driver of value as an organization? And 55% of them say yes, across all sizes, small companies all the way to listed companies of the FTSE 100. The second question we ask is, have you over the last 2 years done any change to your supply chain? And vast majority are saying, yes, of course we have. We need to adapt to the market shifts. And then we ask, what were the rationale behind the change and the investment you made? And 43% said it's about sustainability. So it is there, it is out there, and more companies are investing in this. And we see three main issues when it comes to making the step towards more sustainability as a supplier. The first one is education. So where do I find the information? Who can help me to identify what kind of project am I going to do? The second one is benchmarking, and it is how am I faring against my peers? Am I going to lose the contract with Diageo if I don't invest in sustainability? And am I behind my peers? And the third one is financing. And coming back to this element, I think finance has a key role to play, Ewan, because we need to amend the way we think about risk, and we need to amend the way we assess businesses. And when they are more sustainable, we should take a risk ourselves to promote that and fuel is the right word, right? But support sustainability and making these businesses deliver and fulfill their ambition and their growth. So it is our responsibility. There is a task force, which is a mouthful. It's called Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. But basically, it encourages companies to disclose and track and measure their sustainability. And this is what the financial industry wants to promote, as well as financial innovation to finance these suppliers, your suppliers, on a bilateral basis or with you as a buyer, and we build programs to help them realize their sustainability investments that are critically needed.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask you a follow-up, because it's something I've wondered about for a very long time, and I hesitate a bit because you didn't know this was coming, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So we know, and you know, you've just very eloquently stated that there is a correlation between more sustainable businesses and more profitable businesses. That's great that that correlation exists. What's never been obvious to me is what's causal, which is cause and which is effect. And my heart says one thing and my head maybe says something else. So given that those two things are correlated, aren't we overcomplicating it by thinking about sustainability? Shouldn't we just look at the financial bottom line, and those should be the businesses we continue to invest in? Like, why do we learn more, or why do we make even smarter decisions when we add in this extra thing called sustainability? And does it really matter?
It's a very good question. I guess it does matter because businesses need to change and evolve very quickly. They need to be more agile. But they're not always aware. There must be very good businesses. They're very good at what they do. Their core business is well understood, and they're critical partners to large organizations. So we can't just assess the fact that they're not as profitable or they haven't made the sustainable investment and decide to drop the ball and stop supporting them. I think it's quite critical. It all works as an ecosystem. The supply chain works as an ecosystem. So when we talk about sustainability, you're right, we shouldn't make it too complicated. It's just about innovating and investing for your business to be future-proof. And sustainability should be a core part of the strategy.
Okay, great. I loved that. I hope someone wrote that down. I didn't catch it, but I hope someone else did, because that was fantastic. Anyone else want to come in on that? Yeah, Frederick.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question, actually, based on your question, which is, would you invest within the burglar, the bank robber that you were talking about? And I think the question you just asked is about that. You know, am I going to invest into the bank robber, or am I going to invest into somebody who is generating real tangible value for all of us? And I think the answer is right there.
I think that's a great question. I'm regretting I asked you that now, but that's a great question. I think there's maybe a parallel here in that story I told with the financial markets, that For that period of time when Willie Sutton was riding high, he was a safe bet. He was making so much money that if you were sponsoring him or investing in him, your short-term return was phenomenal. But you always know you're on borrowed time, and the key is getting out just before things start to go wrong. The police are on his tail and he gets arrested. At times in our history, the financial markets work the same way. There is a very short-term view. Everyone knows that the financial performance of an economy and or the sustainability performance of an economy is unsustainable. And we all kind of continue along pretending that's not the case, hoping that we can spot it and get out before the next guy, and then we do okay. But you're absolutely right. Building in long-term value and spotting that long-term value is absolutely critical to deliver the sustainability performance that we want from individual companies and that we need to bake into our societies. And there ought to be the right mechanisms to be rewarded for that.
Well,
was that any good?
There actually is a mechanism, and HSBC released a report a couple of years back that showed that for the first time, and this was a global consumer preference study, I'm sure you're aware of it, but I'll paraphrase one of the key findings to me, which was that for the first time, consumers preferred ethics brands over status brands by wide margins in both developing and developed world. So there is a very big pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and the rainbow is, coming, we're getting close to it, for companies that understand that, the bank robber era is coming to an end, and you can't just market your way to consumer preference. You have to actually be responsible and be ethical, because consumers are now demanding that you are. And that spread between the ethics versus status brands is, I haven't seen the latest, but I bet that it's growing and spreading. Right. So there is a reward for it.
Fantastic. No, that's great. Thank you. That sort of leads on to where I wanted to take us next. Michael, earlier on you talked about the how of internal engagement and getting that senior level buy-in and seeing that trickle down. Could you maybe say a little bit more about the why people at those different levels in those different roles buy into it? Given that they're busy, we don't always see the bigger picture. We've got stuff to do tomorrow, and if this can be put off till the next day, then I get to go home and see my kids before bedtime.
Yeah, it is difficult, because, as you say, as I said earlier, they're busy people. But it goes back to your previous question, perhaps, around, why do we do this stuff? And Diageo don't do it because they want to save the planet. They do it because they want to be around here. We have brands that are 300 years old. We want our brands to be around in 300 years' time. So it's about the two things that were mentioned earlier. It's about risk mitigation, and it's about future-proofing. But also the third bit, and it's been mentioned today a bit, it's about good performance, per se. It doesn't matter how your lines are operating in terms of, say, your bottling lines, or how your talent's being managed, or how your finances are being managed. It's how your business and your supply chains are being managed sustainably is really important. And there's lots of evidence to say, and there's lots of graphs and banks and others have produced them to show that good performing companies on sustainability are good performing companies in terms of shareholder return. And that's what we're about. It's about shareholder return. So I think, to answer your question in a bit of a roundabout way, it's about good performance. So it's embedded about good performance, and individuals are committed to good performance for their function and for their job and for their personal reward, and emotional buy-in to the whole business. Then it becomes part and parcel of that performance review and part and parcel of that performance piece that was expected of high-performing businesses such as Diageo. So if you're part of a high-performing business such as Diageo, and the expectations are very high, the bar is high, so if you're going to perform to that, you need to be including this in your programs. You need to be able to prioritize, because you'll be rewarded as individuals against a whole lot of number of KPIs, one of them which will be this. So this is just one of several, and often in the procurement function, as we always know, they're rewarded on how much money they can save and how they can keep their cost of goods below inflation or just above inflation, depending where you're operating in the world. So they have conflicting, because some of this adds cost, so they have conflicting KPIs, as it were, personally and as a function and as a group, because of these tensions. But it was mentioned earlier, those tensions are good. Those tensions mean that your business is highly tuned into what the issues are, what the opportunities are, and where you're going to be more productive as a business, but equally where you can meet the expectations of your stakeholders, your shareholders principally, but also all the other people that are prepared to comment on your business and how you run your business. So I think it's that linking sustainability to day-to-day performance that is really key. And it doesn't apply to everybody. I'm not pretending everybody in the whole organization is rewarded on sustainability. But in procurement, where they've got that relationship, and this is about supply chain discussion, where procurement are involved, is absolutely critical bit of it. And I understand it needs to be brought into a much bigger ambition about the business, which is ours, is to be one of the best performing, most trusted and respected consumer goods in the world. So we want to get to that. That's our performance ambition, our mantra, if you like. And we won't never get there unless we do performance across all of our metrics well, or very well. And that includes sustainability and all the responsibilities that come with that.
Okay, great, thank you. I maybe want to ask all of you a question, or at least some of you. Could you maybe raise your hand if you work for a company? I don't need Slido yet, thanks, but that's a good chunk of you. Keep it up and raise it as high as you can. Thank you. Keep your hand up if your CEO or someone else in top level of management has a sustainability strategy for the organization and that's publicly stated. So a couple of hands have gone down, but most of them are still up. Keep your hand up if that strategy is well understood across the breadth of your organization and all the way down, and if everybody, or if people by and large buy into that. So we've lost maybe half the hands there. I mean, that's, I think, really telling. It says to me that we've made, as an industry, as a community, however you want to describe us, we've made the right starting steps, but there's still some way to go to delivering some of what we've just heard. So maybe a bit more on what else can be done to help you all deliver that. Pierre, could you maybe say a little bit about how HSBC, the financial services community who works in partnership with a lot of big corporates, what role you have in making sure when I ask that question this time next year, more hands stay up all the way through?
Yeah, of course. So I think that the financial industry is definitely committed to support businesses to become more sustainable. And we have reach, right? So if I take HSBC as an example, but we're not the only one, of course, we are working in 53 countries. We are working with companies from startups all the way to multi-billion-dollar companies. So we can reach the tier 1, the tier 2, the tier 3 suppliers. We can do that. We have the ability to do that in a consistent manner. So, but it goes through the large companies and the medium-sized companies to take the lead on how does it look like for their own network and their own supply chains, and how can banks and financial institutions help. So there are a number of things that exist in the financial. Financial is very creative, right? The financial industry is particularly, it's not always good, but the financial industry is particularly creative. The innovation around sustainability in the financial industry is threefold. One is investor trying to capture the capital. There is a lot of capital flying around. You have loads of billions flying around and trying to find a home with a sustainable asset. And what I mean by that is a lot of hedge funds, a lot of insurance companies, banks, or sovereign funds. I was with the head of the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund recently, and he was telling us that sustainability has become the first criteria when they look at diversifying their portfolio and investing in shares. The first criteria for a financial company who is incentivized on return. That was quite exceptional. Yeah. So coming back to your question, when we see that investors, consumers, and businesses are so keen to do that, we need to leverage our network, our financial expertise, and because we strongly believe that sustainability, good sustainable practices is good for business, our expertise in business, we want to put it to the service of the client. So we work with large organizations, we build programs with them to reach out to their suppliers, tier 1, and if we can, tier 2, and if we know them, tier 3, and try to have a consistent discussion around why does it make sense, and what are the financial tools that exist. It can be short-term financing for your invoices. It can be long-term finances for the solar panels and the kits and the machinery and equipment. It can be funding the software and the technology that's going to make your process more efficient and therefore less energy consuming, for example. So the idea is to work with large and mid-sized organizations to identify with them where are the pain points, the worst offenders, is it domestic, is it international, and how can we work with you to put what we do well, which is funding these businesses, to the service of the ecosystem as a whole and the sustainability of the supply chain.
Great, thank you, thank you. Alex, technology.
Well, for us, so I want to get back a little bit into the concept of, you know, the mission of Supply Shift is to integrate responsible sourcing into everyday business practice. That's our gold standard. And that means integrating lots of data streams in one place, and it also means being able to describe the whole supply chain. And one of the principles for us is, you know, every single company in a supply chain, or a supply web, because of course they're not really chains anymore, is somebody's customer and somebody's tier 1. So as long as we don't look at supply chains as this tree, right? Because they are not trees, because what we've seen, and I'm sure all of you have seen, is that your tier 2 is actually also your customer, and so on and so forth. And your tier 2 can also be your tier 3 in a different web, etc. So as long as we recognize that every single company has the same asking power of their suppliers and the same responsibility to respond to their customers, and all the data needs to be integrated in one place, then at every single node there is value created through the process of data aggregation, there is learning, and there is a benefit to integrating the siloed, you know, oh, that's the supply chain sustainability person that sits way over there, to integrating it into those business decisions so that when HSBC says from the finance department, hey, how are you doing in your responsible sourcing, the finance department doesn't say, I'll get back to you on that one, right? So once the suppliers are seen as a whole, you know, one of the things that we saw happening was, and this was in a textile supplier or a textile customer, the procurement department was pushing on particular suppliers to deliver more than planned, and so they were increasing overtime. The procurement department didn't know that there were overtime problems with particular suppliers. And then the responsible sourcing department was getting, you know, called to the mat because these suppliers that were problematic were just getting worse and they weren't working with them. And it was just a simple inefficiency of not everybody had the same information in the same place. And so that's how we look at it, is the fewer barriers to information flow within the organization and between organizations, the more the results that you're talking about are going to be visible.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Frederick, do you want to add anything to that?
Actually, I would like to add to the core problematic, which is how do we get people to share? How do we get suppliers of suppliers of suppliers?
Excellent.
You know, this is great to have the technology to be able to get all of those informations together to make it an efficient decision. But the trick is, how do you get suppliers to engage when they are not your direct suppliers? And I think we talked about different methods and tactics before, and I think there are some other tactics that are interesting. Before, I think somebody talked about, engaging with the NGOs, because they know very much more about what is happening at the raw material level very often than what is known by retailers or brands. So I think it is important to engage with the NGOs to help in that overall, what I call the extended company. This is, of course, about embarking some other of the customers of the suppliers. Of course, we don't want to get into a competition environment that are too complicated to manage, okay? But at the end of the day, there's certainly somebody using the same supplier somewhere in a different area. And so if you're thinking about either a product category, or you're thinking about a specific commodity, or you're thinking about a specific country, then you can build a group around that so that you've got more power to push within the supply chain. And last but not least, those suppliers are all over the world. As soon as you're mapping your supply chain, right away, you're going to be ending up in 5 countries minimum for any kind of products. When you're talking about apparels, it is even more than that. So I think it is important to really be able to get access to those people by trusted parties. And very often, what I hear from suppliers is, yeah, but if I give that information to the level of my customer, what is ensuring me that it's not going to be shared with other people? So confidentiality of the information is critical. But also the fact of being able to really bring together on a specific element of the supply chain the right people in order to have a bigger push. If you represent 5% of a business, the chance that they're going to reply to you is tiny. If suddenly you are 3 people and you represent 25%, you've got more chance of getting them engaged. So I think you need to think about all of those different strategies on how to engage the extended supply chain. And you need to think about what are the parties that are trusted parties that can help you with that. For instance, within Transparency One, we decided to partner with HGS because they are a big audit and certification body. And so they are the one calling the suppliers. This is not Transparency One calling them, this is HGS. They are recognized as a trusted party. So they are trusted by the supplier when they are called by HGS. So I think this is the kind of techniques that you need to think about to be able to engage in your extended supply chain.
Fantastic, thank you. Can we pull up the Slido, please? Excellent, we've got a few on there already. To give you another moment, I'll ask my final question, starting with Michael, please. So, building a bit on what you just said, Frederic, we all know relationships are key to this, getting people to talk to and work with other people. But above a certain size, of course, data becomes critically important, and being able to gather that and slice and dice it efficiently. How do we make sure the data that we're getting in, we can rely on, is trustworthy? Is there a role for insurance and for assurance? And how do we think about the costs to gather data, the costs to check it versus the returns?
Yeah, so the first point I'll make is to your point, Alex, about the web. So we can't forget that companies like Diageo are also suppliers to retailers, and also some of our suppliers are a lot bigger companies than ourselves, and the web is complicated. So I think that, to your data question, that also makes a thing. So, but it also makes us realize the value of engaging in this stuff, because we get requests from our customers to respond with information on our carbon or our environment or our social performance or whatever. So we recognize what the value is bringing to our business as a supplier versus us being a customer to our supply chain. And I think that's an important point, because some people think that it stops there, but it doesn't. It stops at to the earlier point made, it stops at the consumer for consumer goods companies. And they're probably the biggest influence in this whole thing, ironically, because actually they know the littlest, because they're just given the brand or they're just sold something. So it's, it is a complex, the web is a good way of saying it. It's no longer a chain, and the web there makes us appreciate the value of that. I think the first thing I'd say about data is it's expensive. And with all due respect for everybody around me, these platforms are great, but we have experience about integrating these platforms into an existing, probably out-of-date IT system and the existing platforms we have, and we need to work hard and spend more. So we need to make the case better.
Michael, I said no marketing, please.
I got it.
Sorry.
So I think I'm just being very practical about it. So I know this is the response that you get, and it's absolutely essential that we do continue to modernize, but we have to make internally a business case to our IS function and our business services function every year to make a case for the money which they hold, and they have a huge list of requests and bids, as it were, for that money, and that's a competitive game, to be honest with you. So, and at a time when companies are trying to reduce their overheads, because back to the shareholder value piece, the shareholders want less overheads and more margin and more value and more return. So we're in a kind of it's not vicious, but it's a virtuous circle here that makes it difficult sometimes to invest in stuff that doesn't immediately see return on investment, which back to the issue about being future-proofing and being long-term, and your bank robber analogy. So we're back to that. But what I would say is that I think that data piece is crucial, and I would just say the sharing platforms are crucial to my earlier point about audit fatigue and about data requests. And Diageo, for one, are very good at complaining about how many data requests we get to fill out for various very important stakeholders and very important issues, but there's no harmonization. And that's what is our gripe, I suppose, is there need to be better harmonization. And I'm quite sure our suppliers are grumbling to each other, saying, listen, Diageo is asking us all these questions. Why can't they do it with their competitors and with all the other supply chains? So it's where the technical solutions are really valuable. So the data is expensive, and the authenticity of that data, which was a bit of your question, is important. But I think it's 80-20, to be honest with you, when we're at this stuff. And we can't expect all our suppliers, some of the big ones will have assurance around their data, but we can't impose that. So that's not part of our imposition on our suppliers in terms of our contracts. But our expectation is that they would improve and they would move to best practice, which includes some level of assurance. So I think in the round it is difficult. One company alone shouldn't be even trying to do it on their own, as it were, but it should be collaborating, back to that theme, with others across the technical whiz kids that can pull it all together and do it for us, because that's not our speciality and that's their speciality. So rely on those platforms, but let's try and make those platforms as accessible, as easy, and as harmonized as possible, because we have to do an awful lot of reporting, and I'm sure every one of our suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers have to do likewise.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take the first question here from Slido and maybe give this to you, Pierrick. So even engaged and incentivized suppliers, especially those small ones, need help. They need capacity building. They need other support. How can that be scaled? Yeah,
I think it's a very good question. There are two things. We believe in ecosystems, communities, networks, so that's one thing where HSBC is trying to bring a response. I'm going to take a concrete example. A very large Polish retailer that has 100 strategic suppliers in China wanted the Chinese suppliers to work together to help each other understand best practices and benchmark with each other, but not just as a competitive approach, but as an additional approach to streamline the supply chain, to make it more efficient, from the raw material to the yarn to the transformation that happens in China before getting shipped somewhere else. So one of the key things that we do, or that this company is trying to do, is bringing them together in a number of forums and get the best in class to share the journey they've gone through and explain to others what were the benefits out of this leap of faith they made in investing in sustainability, to try to spread out the knowledge. Because it's true that the smaller the business is, the less the structure you have. You don't have a head of sustainability, a head of operations, who can spend time identifying what options exist to make the business more sustainable. So, but unfortunately, there are not one source of advisory or information. There are a number of platforms that exist where there are information that comes up, where you can identify projects that have been done by others and that you as a business could potentially do as well to improve your sustainability performance, but it's not always the case. So the community of suppliers themselves is sometimes quite a powerful way of identifying quickly the quick wins to make the sustainability investments.
Great, thank you. Maybe just to pick up on that example specifically, so the company in Poland, was it easy for them? You know, did they have just such huge market power over those 100 Chinese suppliers? Are they buying most of what those 100 suppliers produced? So it was comparatively easy to get them to collaborate, or how did that come about?
No, there were two things. First, they were fast growing, and so they had to adapt to a lot of market change and market shifts. So very quickly, they identified that they could not do it with the carrot and the stick or a transactional relationship. They had to work as a community. It was critical. The way they influenced them was to explain the long-term benefits to the ecosystems, and they partnered with some of them on multi-year contracts. So there was an element of safety that was brought to the table for the suppliers. It is not a rock-solid safety saying, I will forever work with you and we will live happily ever after. But there is an element of safety in terms of dual commitment to make the relationship last. And as soon as the suppliers had visibility on the relationship and the flow of business coming from the buyer, then suddenly they decided that they were ready to do that investment.
Okay, great. And is there not a contradiction in some of what we've said here, where on one hand, sustainability leads to, or sustainability and good business performance are linked, it leads to shareholder value, it leads to growth, and with that idea of getting peer companies, competitors to collaborate, where if we are successful in building sustainability into everyday business, it becomes part of what it means to be competitive, and therefore there is competitive advantage associated with the equipment upgrade or whatever else it might be that I've done to get ahead.
I'll pass the question to Michael.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that if the bar's high and then everybody gets to the bar, then where's your competitive advantage? What's where you need to go next? And I think it's a fast evolving area, this, and I think that's part of our challenge, I suppose, is to prioritize and to make sure that we're doing what is really important to us and our business versus what other people might think is something that big businesses should be doing. Yeah. And it's got to be personal to that business, otherwise it won't become part of that business performance. So I think we necessarily have to prioritize, just like every other company, our key issues and our key challenges and the opportunities that come with that. But that doesn't mean we have to do everything. Yeah. And there's some things that are less relevant to us, given our supply chains, delivering our product and our risks, and other things that are really important. Responsible consumption is obviously the top priority for a company selling alcohol, but that won't be for many other consumer goods companies. But equally, we know that there is a fast-changing consumer dimension, a very fast-changing regulatory dimension globally, operating in 180 countries that we operate in. So we know that the bar will continue to move, and it's about getting the pace right and embedding within that, back to that performance piece, into your business and the way you do business, rather than sort of lurching from one sort of issue to another issue to, oh, we'll do that this year, and we'll do that one next year, we'll do that one next year. So I think that the bar, you're absolutely right, the bar will continue to rise, and rightly so. The expectations out there, principally from our consumers, but also from our customers, it will continue to rise. And that's what gives us the competitive advantage, because we think we're closer to that bar than our competitors. And I think there has to be competitive advantage from it, otherwise it won't continue to drive the growth of the business.
Great, thank you. I want to come back to you again, Michael, on this top question here. So most companies are applying a risk-based approach, which is a contradiction. What's the one bit of advice you'd give to those to move beyond that?
Well, it's a bit difficult from a company that probably still takes the risk approach. I think because, back to the data that you gave around, consumers being really interested and really engaged in this area, and we see lots of data around that. And there's been discussion earlier in the day about that, but we're not seeing a lot of evidence that someone will buy, say, a bottle of our Smirnoff vodka versus a bottle of our competitors, say, Absolute vodka, on the grounds of its sustainability performance and its sustainability credentials. I think that might change, and it also depends on whether the Smirnoff brand team want to really engage and pick up that as one of their key brand benefits to communicate to consumers. So that's, again, back, should we be doing more? I think it was a question posed earlier this morning. should consumer companies be doing more to engage consumers so that we can move from that risk-based approach, which at the moment is a kind of corporate risk-based approach, to a opportunity-based approach, which is how do we sell more bottles of Smirnoff as a result of our sustainability credentials and performance versus our competitor brand. And I think we're a bit away from that, but I think where we're seeing it is we're seeing it in our supply chain. The relationships we have with suppliers and this approach to SRM, to strategic relationship management with suppliers, is really important. And we see that because some of our suppliers will be supplying our competitors, and some of them are very, there are only maybe half a dozen big glass suppliers in the world, and we want the most of the cullet, for example, or the recycled glass that goes into it. And how do we get more of that than our competitor? Because we've got our own, because cullet's cheaper than fossil fuel or virgin glass. So how do we drive competitive advantage in the supply chain? And that's the corporate bit, if you like. That's not the consumer-facing piece. So we do see opportunities there. The same might be with if we work very well and closely with our smallholder farmers in Africa. We work in like 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. If we get really good relationships with them and build trust through the supply chain, help on their social and their economic and their environmental performance to make their communities and their families more resilient, then will that make them trust us more and have stronger relationships with us? So when there's a drought or when there's a very high demand and not enough supply, that they'll still supply us, that supplier loyalty piece as well, that they won't just always go on price, and that they'll come to us again and again. That's our supply chain resilience, that's our business continuity. So there are really kind of specific areas which we know that give us competitive advantage if we continue to build a solid platform on this going forward. But I think, us as many, and investors as well, the investors will look at it from a risk perspective and say, is Diageo managing its risk effectively? And if they are, fine, we won't ask too many questions and we'll continue to invest in the long term in them. But what we want to turn around is an opportunity conversation. We do see it in bits that I've just described, but the key bit would be the brands really starting to communicate with consumers.
Great, thank you. Frederick, we know, I guess we probably all experienced that an IT tool is only ever as good as the implementation of it. There's a question about change management and how organizations can deal with the change management aspect of what it takes to going from doing not much to actually having a fully operationalized sustainability strategy. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, I can say something about that. There's no difference between change management related to any topic or change management related to the resilience of your supply chain. At the end of the day, this is about helping people evolve within the culture that you would like them to go to, okay? And as for any change management project, what do? You first try to identify the people who are the easiest to work with, because then you set them up as an example for all of the others, okay? And you start working with them, because then you can go to the next level much easily. And if the next level is saying that those people are giving you transparency, then they will be more entitled to give you more transparency. And then after that, you use some of the KPIs. You talk to your suppliers who don't want to get into it. You say, look, I've got those 9 suppliers that are ready, and you're part of the 3 that are not ready, okay? And then you're starting, this is the stick and the carrot. On the change management, first you look for the motivated and the one who know how to do it. Then you educate the people who are motivated but don't know how to do it, so that you help them. And the IT tools of today are much easier to use than any of them before, because of all of the push of usability that happened in the last few years. And then, you end up with the ones that are not willing, they don't know, they have no idea how to go, and, those people, you might have to change them. You might have to decide to switch horses, because this is the direction that you have identified for your company, and you need to have very clear rules. You talked about involving the procurement, making that as part of the contract. I think it is really critical to have a very clear strategy to make it available to everybody. And at the end of the day, the one who don't want to get into it, you might have to change and take some other suppliers that are ready to go for it.
Great, thank you. Alex, you've quoted a few different bits of market research and survey data and things. I might come to you first to answer that question about consumers that's up there. They always say they'd prefer the ethical brand, but of course they would, wouldn't they? Are people starting to put their money where their mouths are?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting one, and I'll actually steal, in this case, I'm not going to steal statistics, although we can talk about the market trends, and if anybody wants to, I can talk about that a bit. But I'll steal the words. I'm not in the habit of naming customers, but this one I'll name because this was in a public forum. Wrangler is a customer, and they were talking about their work using SupplyShift to deal with a lot of the data collection for TSC, for Walmart, and other retailers. And in the webinar, which we were together on, audience member asked, so how do you justify spending money and energy on this, and what's the ROI? And Rowan Atwood, who is the director of sustainability at Wrangler, said, at this point, it's not about do we justify spending money on this. It's if we don't spend money on this, we become completely irrelevant and we go away. So it is past the price premium, and consumers, and you know, this comes up every year, and I keep saying it every year, and every year it gets a lot fewer eye rolls that, you know, within a few years, if a global brand can't answer the questions of where was it made, who made it, and how did it get to me, they won't be able, it's not going to be a matter of will consumers pay a 10% price premium for, see, I'm not getting any eye rolls, it's here, right? Consumers just won't buy it. You know, Wrangler jeans are not a, you know, niche boutique, organic, fair, you know, they are about as mainstream as it gets as far as apparel goes in the United States. And for them, it's not a matter of, well, do we do it? They are the most strict of our customers as far as their supplier compliance. They take nothing but 100%. So there is no option of not meeting Rowan's deadline. Because for them, it is an existential part. It's not a nice to have. And as far as market trends, you know, 2015 or 2014 was when more than 50% of global consumer spend became millennials and younger. And millennials have incredible brand self-identity nexus. So they're incredibly brand loyal on the one hand, but if something comes out that is negative about that brand, they're much more likely to ditch it and ditch it forever. And so the margin of error, you know, it's not about the price premium. It used to be about the price premium, you know, 5 years ago, right? That was a competitive advantage. That was oh, I can charge more. And our colleague from Unilever was talking about the CEO report from Unilever, I think it was about 6 months ago, where they said that their responsible brands are responsible within Unilever for something like 74% of the revenue growth, even though they constitute 47% of the portfolio, right? So it's just, that's just where things are going from a market perspective.
Great, thank you, thank you. We've got time, quick question from Michael before I ask my final question. So I want to ask you that one about supplier engagement's comparatively easy when it's a supplier that you've got a long-standing relationship with. There's a strategic partnership there. It's a bit harder with commodity supply chains where you're buying on the spot market, or you can switch pretty quickly. How do you think about that?
Absolutely right, and I alluded to that earlier about, you know, where you have influence and where you're going to go for the 80-20. I think we're recognizing that, so we do have a much more kind of in-depth conversations with our commodity buyers now. We don't do an awful lot of it actually compared to to some companies because we're actually quite small procurers, you know, in terms of how many thousands of tons or hundreds of thousands of tons we buy. So we're not a big customer of Cargill or Bunge, where we do, but we are customers of them. So I think where we see our input is just to continue to ask them to raise the bar. So when we look for that, there's two things. It's about the performance and also about their transparency of supply chain. You know, so they need to get on top of their transparency of their supply chain, okay? And that's what we're pushing them on. And we had one, we buy quite a lot of sugar, and we wanted to get we don't have any sugar mills ourselves, we just buy sugar on the markets, and locally where there's benefit from buying it locally, we'll try to do that, but often that's not possible. But we went to our sugar supplier or the sugar commodity buyer and said, we need to know what mills are growing, processing the sugar, where the sugarcane fields are, and what the conditions of those sugar, so those often migrant workers are in Central America, for example, and what they're doing and how they're being looked after, to your point, you know, right through to probably the 4th, 5th tier by this stage. And they responded. So and the more people that answer that question, the better. But it wasn't something they could take off the shelf and say, there you go. They didn't have the systems in place to say, right, to you guys. They didn't have a system. They pressed the button and said, there you go, there's a report for Diageo, that's where it goes. No, it took months. And that was just one commodity. Now, there's more risk in sugar in Latin America than there is in maize in Iowa, right? So it's about prioritizing that. Or, we have aniseed in Turkey, for example. So there's probably more risk in that, in some small volume, very small volume, which is why our agricultural strategy is not based on volume, but based on risk and based on those supply chains. So I think it's a very important question. The more of the Diageos that can answer those questions of those huge commodity buyers to say, listen, we need transparency, we need that chain of custody to understand, right, to your point about we need our consumers and our customers want to know where the sugar cane is grown, that goes into the sugar mill, that then goes into the distillery that makes Captain Morgan, for example. Right? I want to know where the sugar comes from that goes to Selden Captain Morgan, and we need to know that, and we recognise that, and it's a beginning of quite a long journey, to coin an old phrase, but we need to put pressure on them.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. It's always good to finish with a question about the future. So thank you very much, Famke, for teeing this up. In 10 years' time, what information will consumers have, will investors have to make decisions on that they don't have today? In 30 seconds, Frederick.
Wow, that's a good one. I wasn't not expecting that one. In 10 years' time, I'm sorry, I'm not going to answer directly to your question. What I'm going to say is that I'm going to come back to the brand remark that was made before.
Great.
I don't think this is about bringing all of the information to the consumers. As it was said before, consumers, we all need to trust the brand we are buying from, because we're not going to spend our time using an application to verify everything. And that trust is here and is going to continue to be here. But what needs to happen is that the brands need to bring the right framework of communication to the consumers so that the consumers trust that they have the information, that they know what they're talking about, and that this is not the greenwashing that has been happening in the last X years. And I think this is what needs to happen with the consumers in the next 10 years, is that they need to have trust. They will continue to need to have trust, and they will only have trust if they are sure that this is not washing anymore. This is real information that is right there in the systems.
Perfect. Thank you. Alex?
Well, from a technology perspective, and I think it's going to be way sooner than 10 years, is you're going to be able to snap a picture of any product, and it will have an augmented reality layer that will tell you exactly what's going on. And if you move your phone or, I don't know, some other device in 10 years over a product,
that's frightening from the technology
that information is not there, you're going to skip right over it. And it's not just going to be sustainability. It's going to be, E. coli counts in the factory, or, you know, if it's lettuce, or, you know, food safety, labor, etc. But it will, you know, we're already seeing augmented reality layers over actual reality, and I think that that's going to be a very potent tool, and people will just expect to see it, just like they expect to see a nutrition label. And I know those technologies, and we're implementing them. So.
Great, thank you. Pierrick from the investor community.
I think that there is more and more financial disclosure obligation, ESG reporting, the benchmarking are moving tremendously. The third parties who are analyzing and benchmarking suppliers are more and more compelling. We see the consumer pressure, the investor pressure. It becomes access to capital becomes so linked to sustainability and will be within the future that I think that you will be, as a consumer, pretty well aware of the companies that are golden standard when it comes to sustainability. So I think this is definitely a wind of change that's going to be there within the next 10 years.
Great, thank you. Final word to you, Michael.
Well, a bit difficult to define. I think I entirely agree with you about consumers, and I agree with both of you in terms of it should be baseline. It should be, there's no premium there. It's just what we should be delivering. To take the other end of the value chain, there's consumers, there's investors at the other end. I hope, or I think, in 10 years' time, investors won't invest in stock unless you're doing this very well. And I really hope that. I think it's going that way already. We're seeing league tables come out. League tables and benchmarks are what run investment decisions and analysis, obviously. And I think within 5 to 10 years, we're seeing all, was it just this month, league tables announced for companies performing against the Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah. You know, so investors in 5 years' time will say, hang on, this company's doing nothing. It hasn't got a future. And we're talking about proper investors. I'd like to see pension funds and long-term investors only invest in companies that are performing well. And you need to perform well. We need to continue to hold ourselves to account. But just taking the opposite end of the value chain, I think investors will have consumers will drive very clearly and very importantly, but equally I think investors and shareholders, and we're all shareholders through pension funds and otherwise, so I think that will be a very important dimension going forward.
Great, thank you. 4 fantastic panelists. I'm willing to bet that no other panel this week knows more about robbing banks than our one did today. I've also spotted another element of diversity across the two of us. The guidance came out that speakers were encouraged to wear ties. And it's clear we've got 2 conformists and 3 rebels over there. So with that, please thank the panelists for